Okay. Has anybody here ever um, read the prayer book of a Sephardic sitter? No.
No.
All right. So Sephardic Jews, they have a very interesting thing that they do, not just in prayers, but really in everything. And that is before they do any mitzvah, they say L'Shem Yichud. You ever heard those words, L'Shem Yichud? Oh, what happened to my Zoom? Anybody ever heard L'Shem Yichud before?
No, never heard of it.
No, I don't think so.
All right, so
And I've
L'Shem
read the Sephardic, but I haven't heard those words.
All right, so even if you're not Sephardic, we do say it once a day, at least Ashkenazim do, and that is there's a prayer called Baruch She'amar. It's in the beginning of the prayers, towards the beginning of the morning prayers, where we praise God who spoke and created the world. And right before we say those words, we say L'Shem Yichud Kudsha Brichu U'Shechinte. We say we are here to unite God and his Shekhinah. Okay, so the word Yichud. So now we, as at least on Chabad, we say that once a day before we do a mitzvah to unite the Shekhinah and the God, so to speak, whatever that means. But Sephardim actually say the word Yichud. They say L'Shem Yichud before they do any mitzvah. So before they'll put on tefillin, they'll say a L'Shem Yichud for that. Before they put on tefillin, they'll say L'Shem Yichud. Before any mitzvah they do, before they shake lulav and etrog, they'll say L'Shem Yichud. So now you know if you meet a Sephardic Jew, you'll find out that they say these lines L'Shem Yichud in order for the unification, and they say that before they do any mitzvah. Why am I mentioning that? Because today we're going to have a lengthy discussion and a detailed discussion on the topic of Yichud, oneness. As you may have, or I should say unity, as you may have already gathered, Judaism is kind of obsessed with unity. We have discussed that many times. And today we're going to take it one step further, and we're going to actually delve into it in a way that when you first look at it, you might say, why do I need to know all the different stages of unity? Why do I need to know the exact details of unity? But as we delve into it, you will see the beauty that comes out of it. And it's really a topic and a discussion of understanding what happens when we do a mitzvah. And all this boils down to our discussion the last couple of weeks. So here we get to our general summary. Our general summary has been the last couple of weeks. What have we been discussing? We've been discussing that unity is at the core of all the commandments. Why? We said all the commandments are based on the first two commandments, and the first two commandments are all about unity. As we described, in reality, the world is unified with God, right? When we say God is one, we mean God is one with everything. However, the reality that we perceive as God creates it is that we are not unified with him. He creates this shell, like the turtle shell, where from our end, we do not seem unified with him. And the whole purpose and idea of mitzvot, of commandments and good deeds, as we are going to describe now, and as we've been describing last week, is to get back to that place of unity, to somehow become unified with God again. Now, again, from God's perspective, the unity already exists. We're talking about from our perspective, in our world, for us to feel the unity with God. And as we're going to describe this, not only to feel the unity with God, but to actually be unified with God. In other words, I can feel unified with anything I want, but that may not be true, right? And we're gonna have different ways that we're going to unify ourselves with God. And the most obvious and simplest way is the unity that comes through doing mitzvot and studying Torah. Through doing mitzvot and studying Torah, we are going to be able to be unified with God. And this unity, as we're going to describe today, actually takes place on a couple levels. Okay? Level number one is what we're going to call the unity of a wagon to the wagon driver. That's going to be our example number one. Example number two is going to be the unity of your body with your soul. And then the third level of unity is going to be the unity of you and your thoughts. You and your thoughts. Okay. So who can tell me the difference between the unity of the body and the soul and the wagon driver? Now you may say, Rabbi, what do you mean? Where is there a unity between the wagon and the wagon driver? So I guess I should start with that. Who can tell me if there is a unity between the wagon and the wagon driver? Are they unified in anything?
Are we talking about consistency? Consistency more than like unity. I don't understand how a driver would not be unified with his driving, but consistency where he's thinking to drive to the right and he actually does that, that's
you're on the path. Exactly. The fact that
I'm sorry, Nina, I didn't mean to interrupt, Nina. I just wanted to
no.
How
Anita,
are you,
you got it good. It's hard on Zoom. Zoom is not like a room.
Yeah.
A room is...
I know. Thank you.
You did a better job.
Oh my gosh, no. Thank you.
So that's a very good point, and that's actually the point that we're going to discuss. This idea that the wagon follows exactly what you want. Your car should, okay, if it's a working car, your car should drive to where you want to drive. That is a level of unity. What is the unity? That the wagon follows your desire. The car follows your desire. Unity happens, one way of unity, I should say, is when one person gives up their persona for the other. Okay? When spouses unite, that's how that can happen, right? They can live very separate lives, or they can each care about the other, and that creates a certain level of unity. For people to get along, right? You have to some extent, you have to, for some extent, put aside your own desires and be unified together for a unified cause. For example, now the Jewish people in Israel are to some extent unified in their desire to eradicate Hamas, though of course there's divisions cracking based on exactly how it happens. But unity typically happens when at least one of the parties puts aside their desire and allows the other desire to flow through them. That's what makes it unified. You're unified with their desire. The car is unified with me in my desire. And Nina wrote here the idea of a shared will. That's also a true example. So if all Jewish people, for example, were to follow what God wants all the time, in all aspects of our lives, okay, not just between us and God, but between us and another human being, we would have automatic unity, because we would be operating for a shared will and a shared desire. That's what unifies a country. If you have a unified desire, that's where cracks in a country come, when there's a debate about what is our desire for this country and where do we want it to go. So unity happens typically when we're talking about separate entities. It happens through a unified desire and a unified will. And that's what's going on when you have a car that works, or you have a wagon that works. Obviously, in the times of the Tanya, they didn't have cars, so they talk about wagons. But that's how it works. Is in order for there to be a unity, there needs to be some subservience of will. And the ultimate example of a subservience of will is something that really has no will, like a wagon, like a car. It has no will. It becomes one with your will. You want to drive to New York, it'll drive to New York. You want to drive to Florida, it'll drive to Florida. Now, it's very easy with a car. It's a lot harder with people, right? To create that level of unity. But actually, our sages use this example of a wagon to describe our patriarchs and matriarchs. It says that they were like a wagon to God, a chariot to God. What does it mean they were a chariot? It means that they were complete conduits for what God wanted. They were conduits. They had no self-desire. Just like the wagon has no self-desire, they had no self-desire. They would do only what God would want. Just to bring this down in an example, they say about the Maggid of Mezrich, the Maggid of Mezrich, the great Hasidic master who followed the Baal Shem Tov, they would say about him that when he would give charity, he would stretch out his hand to give charity, and then his hand would remain out until his hand had something else useful to do, maybe wash his hands. Basically, he would only move his body parts if there was a mitzvah involved. The moment there was no mitzvah, he would just leave it there because it had nowhere to go. It's an extreme example, but it's trying to express this idea of a chariot, that they become, that's what a chariot is. A chariot has no will and desire of its own, and it completely follows the will of its rider. And our patriarchs and matriarchs were always a chariot for God, but to an extent, or parts of us can also be a chariot to God. In certain moments, we can be a chariot to God, being conduits for God's will. What is God's will? Anybody knows? What does God want? What is God's will?
Torah and Mitzvot.
Very good.
Sorry.
Very good. He tells us, oh, very good. It's okay to have more than one person. It's very good.
Somebody else was saying something.
I don't know. It's good. It's fine. Like I said, it's Zoom. It's not like a room. It's hard to see. So yeah, the Torah and the Mitzvot is God's will and desire. So you can say when we are doing a commandment, we are becoming at that moment, even though we're not like our patriarchs and matriarchs, we are at that moment a conduit for God's will. Okay, like the wagon. God says put on tefillin, we're putting on the tefillin. God says eat the matzah, we're eating the matzah. Even though we don't like the matzah, we're eating the matzah anyways, right? Especially the shmor matzah. Not, some people like the shmor matzah. All right, so that being said, we're going to say the same thing actually applies to a certain extent to the limbs of your body. The limbs of your body is another example of subservience. If the car is subservient to your desires, your limbs are subservient to your will. The moment you want to move your hand, there's no break. It happens right away. It's not like your hand says, well, I'm not sure I want to move. Can I go somewhere else? Right? The hand works. In fact, a sign of sickness is when the limbs are not following what the mind wants. That means there's an illness, there's a disconnect. But healthy limbs follow the will and the desire of the person. Any questions on that example? Okay. I do want to point out that commentaries on the Tanya point out that not all parts of our body are subservient to our will. For example, our stomachs have their own set of rules, and they sometimes tell the brain what they want. But so it doesn't mean all parts of our body, but many parts of our body are. So it's not all, but many parts of our body are subservient to the will of our mind. The best examples are the hands and the feet, and they are an example again for a unity. The hand becomes unified with me, whoever I am, right, is unified with my desire at that moment. So can you tell me a difference between the wagon and the limbs of the body? Any thoughts?
More or less versatility.
More or less versatility. I mean, that's just ability, but I'm talking in the unity that exists between the two.
They serve. They have a serving role. They take commandments and they do it.
One is self-commanded.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean self-commanded?
Like works in unison, like my mind is going to tell my limbs. But the other is more two different governing kind of things.
We're on the path. We're getting there. Yes, Adam?
They all have a function. I mean, a wheel cannot be anything other than a wheel. The hand cannot be anything other than the hand, and each has its own function to make the whole work.
Mm-hmm.
Like if the wheel is missing, the whole doesn't work. If the hand is missing, the whole doesn't work.
Yes, right.
Well, I'm sorry, it's Beth. isn't the chariot an inanimate object, unlike our hand or our body is controlled by our brain, but a chariot is not a human thing. It's just an object, not controlled really by a brain.
Right. Okay. So everybody's kind of getting the idea. Yeah. Very good. Using different words, and they're all correct. Getting to the essence. The essence, what we're trying to break it down to, is the unity. And you're correct. The unity of a limb with your will is much greater than the chariot, because at the end of the day, the chariot is a separate object. You can use the word controlled. You can use the word inanimate, but it exists as a separate entity that is for a moment unified with your will, versus your limbs, that there's nothing in the world that is as unified that we can point to as a soul and a body. I mean, there's nothing that looks as the same as a soul and a body. And so that's really the essence of what we're getting to. There's a unity of a body and a person, right? The person's will. Sorry, the unity between the body and the soul. It's a very deep unity. They almost become one. And then there's a unity of the chariot. The chariot, at the moment it's doing the will of the person, it does indeed become unified with the person's will. But even at that moment, you can look at it and see that it is a very separate entity. And so what we're going to get with these two examples, and Hasidic philosophy is full of examples, is that there are different elements of us. When we do a mitzvah, there are different elements of us. And some of them are unified with God's will in a way that they're separate entities, but become unified in God's will, because God's will, they become conduits for God's will. Then there are some elements that become so unified with God, like a body and a soul. It's an even closer relationship. And then there's a third stage, which we're going to get to, and that is the Torah. And but that example we'll have to get to at the end. But for now, understand these two types of unities. There's a unity which can exist at the level of a body and a soul. It's a very deep unity, because the body and the soul become so unified as to seem as if they are one, even though they're not one, because we do die, and when we die, the body remains and the soul leaves the body. And then there's the unity of the chariot rider and the rider, which always seem separate, though they can be unified in a single cause. Okay. But regardless of your level of unity, and we'll tell you when you have which one. Regardless of your level of unity, you will experience a unity with God when you do a mitzvah. Now you're understanding a little bit more about what it means when we do a mitzvah, l'shem yichud, when we create this unity. And truthfully, when I thought about it before this class, the world is obsessed with unity, with a level of oneness, and it's for a good thing. By the way, we're all seeking a level of unity, whether it's in a marriage, whether it's in a friendship, whether it's with spouses, whether it's friends, congregants. There's all different areas of our life. I wrote down some more examples. Oh yeah, unity with food as well. We can be unified with our food. People like to invest themselves in a book. People like to invest themselves in a movie. Life is all about unity with the things around us. That's what we do. The human being is very much always getting into moments of unity. And what the Torah tells us is that, yes, of course, you can choose to unify yourself with the world around you in a mundane way, or you can choose to unify yourself with God. And how do you unify yourself with God? That is through the Torah and the Mitzvot. And that's really the why unity takes up a large discussion. In fact, in Hasidic philosophy, the unity that's used to describe is actually the intimacy, and the unity of a husband and wife is usually the ultimate expression of unity. That's why King Solomon uses a relationship of a man and a woman in his description of Shir Shirim, Song of Songs. When it's done right, that is to an extent, a great example of unity that exists here on this earth. And that is why that level of unity actually creates the most godly thing. The most godly thing is a child. Future generations are the most godly thing. Why? Because it's the only thing that can last forever to an extent. In other words, everything in this world decays and falls apart. However, the ability to have children and our children to have children and their children to have children is the only thing in this world that's really everlasting. Everything else decays and falls apart from what it was. The human being can technically prognate forever. I mean, so can animals as well. Which Hasidic philosophy discusses that. But the point is that the most godly act, which is a unity, creates children. And it says actually the same thing happens when we do a mitzvah. When we create unity in heaven, it creates spiritual children. It's for another discussion. Tanya will talk about it another time. I'm just pointing out to you. I just want to get you familiar with this topic of unity and how great of a discussion it is in the Kabbalah and the mysticism. And that's because unity is really this very important topic. We don't realize we spend all our days seeking unity in our life to be unified with things around us. And unity is at the backbone of all living beings. The unity between the parents, the mating. That's the backbone of our society. And it's that way designed. Everything physical mirrors a spiritual thing. And in spirituality, it also works that way, that unity is the backbone of everything that we require and desire here on this earth. It's what creates blessings. Really, everything when they unify, that's how they create. Even in non-beings, I think in weather patterns, right? Is when two things come together, they create a third thing. You know, if you look at how the hurricanes are formed, all different things in the world are formed by two things coming together. And that's the reality of the world we live in, because that is actually the spiritual reality as well. Okay, so with that being said, we are going to get right in here. We are in chapter 23, and we're going to jump into page. Share with you, Chrome tab. Let's see, photos. Okay. Share. Okay. We are going to be over here, page 256, I believe. 256. Unless someone has a marker. Sorry, 257. All right, so let's start reading about this unity. Let's read over here. That's why the mitzvot are referred to metaphorically by the Tikkunei Zohar as organs of the king. For just as the organs of your body are vehicles of expression for your soul, since the organs are completely surrendered to your soul with all their being, so too the mitzvot are absolute expressions of divine will. When you will your leg to move, it moves. And if you're healthy, your leg won't move on its own unless you instruct it to. So your leg, as well as all your other organs, are a reliable and direct expression of your will. So again, the Zohar uses an example that the mitzvos are like the limbs of God or the organs of God. Now, obviously, we all know God does not have organs. So why is it using that example? Organs are played in other places of worship. Okay, it's a joke. So why are organs described as God's mitzvos? What's the connection? Now you can understand. The mitzvos are called God's organs because just as the organs and the limbs, they are surrendered to the soul that's within it. They move, they listen. The mitzvos are also a conduit and expression for God's will. So let me read it back inside here. When you will your leg to move, it moves. And if you're healthy, your leg won't move on its own unless you instruct it to. So your leg, as well as all your other organs, are reliable and direct expressions of your will. The same is true of the mitzvos. The Zohar did not describe the mitzvos as organs to imply that God is a physical body. The Zohar's point was that the mitzvos are pure and direct expressions of the divine will, just as your organs are an absolute reflection of your soul. That's powerful. Your hand moving is an expression of what you want. If you slap someone, you can't say, I didn't want to do that, right? No, that's what you wanted. It's a direct expression of you. You can say, no, my soul is spiritual. I didn't want to hit you. Well, no. That's you. The same thing is the mitzvos. The mitzvos are direct expressions of God's will. You can see God's will in the commandments. Let's continue. Tanya now elaborates in more detail. For when a person wants to stretch out his hand or foot, then those limbs obey his will immediately and unhesitatingly, without him having to consciously instruct or direct the limbs, and without any pause at all. Rather, they react instantaneously as soon as the will for them to move arises. In the same way, a person's limbs are totally surrendered to his will. The same is true figuratively with God's relationship to the life energy invested in the mitzvos act and their fulfillment. That energy is completely surrendered to the divine. Now, notice how he said the life energy invested in the mitzvahs act. So the energy you put into doing the mitzvah. So let's say you are blowing a shofar. At the moment that you're blowing the shofar, you are to God's will what your hand is to your will. That's what he's saying here. Just as the hand is an expression of your will, and at that moment your hand is unified with the will of your soul, when you're blowing the shofar, or conversely using your ear to listen to the shofar, using your life energy to listen to the shofar, at that moment, your breath or your ear is a direct expression of God's will, because that's what God wants. It's as if God's moving his hand. It's an incredible oneness that you have with God. As he says, in their relationship is literally like a body and a soul. The reference to life energy here is a twofold implication. It refers to the energy the person invests in performing the mitzvah, and B, it also refers to the life energy of the object used to fulfill the mitzvah, meaning every single object in this world has an energy, divine force energy that God gives it, and that energy that God is giving it at that moment becomes one with God's will. So not only are you elevating yourself, but you're elevating the object if there's an object involved. So let's take the shofar example. The shofar is now very excited because the divine energy that's vivifying it at every moment has now transformed from just creating a ram's horn to becoming an expression of God's divine will. It's now very excited. It's now very happy that you've included it in this most wonderful unification that is going to get with God. That's what's special. That's what's very special. Now we're going to continue. And he says, and similarly, when you fulfill and observe a mitzvah, the outermost garment of your divine soul, which is the divine soul's power component of action, becomes immersed in the energy of the mitzvah act. That's what I was saying. Like when you're blowing, the outermost garment of your soul, which is action. Remember, we had 3 garments of the soul: thought, speech, and action. The outermost garment of your soul, if there's an action involved in the mitzvah, right? Some mitzvahs are in the brain, but if there's an action, which most have an action, at that moment, that outer layer of your divine soul becomes immersed in the energy. It becomes one with it. And he says like this, and the garment of action is also utterly surrendered to the divine will, like a body is surrendered to its soul. So let's read what he says here. He's just hearkening back to what we said in chapter 4 about the garments of the soul. As we learned in chapter 4, the divine soul has 3 garments of thought, speech, and action. The garment of action is also absorbed into the mitzvah act and becomes one with God. In summary, a mitzvah absorbs into the divine will, A, the life energy of the mitzvah object itself. So let's say the energy that vivifies the shofar, right? God is to create everything, so that now the shofar, it's become a conduit for God, so it becomes subsumed within God's will. B, the life energy used by the person to perform the mitzvah, and that could be your bodily energy. C, the action garment of the divine soul. The Tanya will now add one more to the list: the physical limb used to perform the body. So till now, all of these things we were talking about were the more spiritual elements: the life energy that vivifies the shofar, the life energy of your soul, and the garment of your soul, right? Because the garment is not your soul itself. That's why it's called a garment. Now he's going to continue talking about your actual body, yourself, your hand, your ears, not just the energy of your soul that hears, but the hearing, the physical limb that hears. So it's an interesting thing to separate. But again, when you're hearing, who's hearing? It's your soul is hearing through the medium of your body, but your soul hears. The soul hears. When we die, or we don't hear anymore. We need ears to hear. The soul doesn't need ears to hear. When the soul is physical, it needs ears to hear. When it's not physical, it doesn't need ears to hear. It's just like this. Therefore, your bodily organs too, when you absorb the mitzvah, are surrendered to the divine will. Since your divine soul's component power of action is invested in those bodily organs, at the moment you perform and observe the mitzvah, these organs become an actual chariot to the divine will. And here's the first time he's using the word chariot, and now you understand why, based on my explanation. All the other objects we mentioned till now were all physical, right? The life energy of the mitzvah object, the life energy of the person, the garment of the soul, which is still spiritual. But once we get to a physical object, physical objects are going to be like a chariot, because at the end of the day, they cannot have the same absorbance within the divine will, because they are, at least to our physical eyes, very much separate. They're non-spiritual items. And I would make the argument, I don't know, it doesn't say here, but I would make the argument the physical shofar itself, not the life energy that makes the shofar, but the physical shofar itself also would be like the physical elements of your body, that they become like a chariot. Again, they are subsumed to become one with God, but they are more like a chariot. Okay, let's continue. For example, the hand which distributes charity to the poor, or performs another mitzvah, or the feet that walk for mitzvah activity, or similarly, the mouth and tongue which speak words of Torah, or the brain which contemplates words of Torah, or the reverence of heaven, or the greatness of the blessed God. And the Tanya now illustrates this idea with citation of the Midrash. So now he's going to explain the concept of a chariot. But you're getting the idea here. Any part, physical part of your body that gets involved in a mitzvah becomes a chariot to God. And as we explained earlier, chariot means, yes, it is subservient at that moment and unified with the will of God, yet at the same time being a separate entity. Unlike a body, which becomes so unified with the soul that they seem almost inseparable, though they are, the chariot always seems separate, though it can unify in a certain element, and that is in the will of God. So our bodies can become unified at that moment in the will of God. But I want to say, just because I'm saying the chariot is lower than, just because I'm saying the chariot is lower than the chariot is lower than the unification of a body, doesn't mean it's bad. And I'm sorry for keeping you in the waiting room. I'm using a different computer. It was hard. Okay, doesn't mean it's not good. Okay, it's amazing that we have the opportunity. Even our physical bodies have the opportunity to become one with God. And by the way, your soul, we were talking about here, your soul becoming unified with God. You might say, well, my soul is godly. You're right, your soul is godly in its essence. But the part of your soul that's down here, we call it in the Kabbalah say it's elokus shenasanever. It's like godliness that has become a creation. Our souls do in this world feel like separate identities from God. And so when the soul has the opportunity to unify with God, it's a great opportunity for it. And definitely for your body to become unified with God's will, even in just a chariot level, is very special. I want to give an example of just an interesting example of where the body can become unified with God and God's will. So there was it's a story. There was a chassid, a follower of the third Chabad Rebbe. His name was Rabbi Elio Yosef Midrivin, and he had a very, very terrible disease. And the doctors told him he would not be able to be healed. So Rabbi Elio Yosef said that the illness that he had is actually discussed in the Code of Jewish Law. Where does the Code of Jewish Law discuss this? We know in Jewish law, if an animal cannot survive for 12 months, it's considered treif. It's considered not kosher. Even if it was slaughtered and salted, if it had a disease that it would die within 12 months, it would be not kosher. So when you go to actually a Jewish slaughterhouse, they blow up the lungs. That's where the whole idea of glatt kosher comes from. The lungs have to be smooth. That's what glatt kosher means. Not glatt means it's not smooth. They feel all the intestines to see that there's no ruptures or anything. So they checked different parts of the animal to check that it could have survived at least another 12 months. And that's why, by the way, halal is not kosher. Even if it was slaughtered properly and slaughtered by a Jewish person, it may not be kosher. In fact, my understanding is 50% of the animals in, at least when I was in Postville, Iowa, where they have a slaughterhouse, end up being not kosher. And they sell it as halal. That's okay. It's fine. It's a good business for them. But my point is that that's what treif. People hear the word treif. They think treif means all not kosher. Actually, the word treif is from the word, the Torah used the word treifa. Treifa means an animal that was torn apart by another animal, which means it couldn't have survived. And so any animal that could not have survived for 12 months is considered not kosher. So back to our story, this Rabbi Leo said, this disease that I have, there's actually a debate in the code of Jewish law whether an animal with the same disease can survive. And he said the Ashkenazic rabbi, who is called the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserlich, said that such an animal cannot survive. But the Bet Yosef, the famous Sephardic writer, said that such an animal can survive. And he said, you know what, I'm going to move to Israel, because in Israel, the Sephardic rabbi's rulings are accepted. And if I move to Israel, then I will follow the rulings of the Bet Yosef, and then I will be able to survive this disease. And he went to his Rebbe, he got a blessing for it, and he moved to Israel, and he lived for another 20 years. What's the point of this story? Sounds like a cute story, but it brings out this concept that the mitzvot that we have allow the physical limbs to become a conduit for God's will. And so to an extent, it's a cute story, so to speak, but he tapped into this idea that since in Israel, where the Sephardic rabbi is accepted, and his rulings are accepted, so there's almost, you might want to say, a different reality that exists there, based on the divine will that exists in the land of Israel. Now you might say, how could there be a different will between Israel and not Israel? That's a lengthy discussion, because we can ask that question about everything. Okay, how can it be that for an Ashkenazic Jew to eat beans on Passover is bad, and for a Sephardic Jew to eat beans on Passover is good, right? How is there more? And that's just one example. There's hundreds of examples if you delve into it. Different rulings for Ashkenazim and Sephardim. That's a discussion for another time, because we really don't have enough time to delve into that today. I wouldn't give it justice. But the point is that the physical world and the elements with which mitzvahs are done can become unified with God to the point of being a chariot for God. Okay. Of course, I want to mention here that even though we're saying mitzvot are chariots for God, what about the rest of our day? So there's a discussion. It's a discussion we might, I don't know if we'll have the idea that we can incorporate God in all parts of our life, even when we're not technically doing a mitzvah. But we're going to leave that discussion aside for now, because we have to get to the discussion, the important discussion of mitzvahs. But I just putting that out there. I don't want you to feel depressed about the rest of your day. The rest of your day can also be dragged along in your mitzvahs endeavors, just like kind of a family. Family dynamic has a lot of moving elements to it, and some moments are more important than others, if you want to call it that, but you need all the moments. That's kind of how it works. But all right, let's put that aside. Now we are going to go to the next stage, and the next stage is Torah. Torah has an even deeper level of unity than the. Oh, sorry. Before we get to Torah, let me just finish off this section. He's going to bring the example of chariots from our patriarchs, which I told you about it in the beginning of the class. And this is the meaning of our sages teaching the patriarchs were genuinely a chariot. The chariot refers not only to surrender of the mind, but also the body, since all the patriarchs' organs were sacred and detached from this worldly concerns, and throughout all their days, their organs were only acted as a chariot of the divine will alone. Okay, I explained the chariot before. But here he's going to say what I said over here. The Tanya is careful to distinguish here between the level of chariot achieved by the patriarchs and the chariot brought about by mitzvah's observance. As he says, when we observe a mitzvah, only the particular organ we make use of becomes a chariot, and B, we are not observing mitzvahs without interruption. But the patriarchs, all their limbs were sacred and detached from this worldly concerns, and this was throughout all their days continuously. Okay, so we get the chariot when we do a mitzvah, whereas the patriarchs and matriarchs were always conduits for God's will. Okay, so we're not necessarily at their level, but we can get to it to some extent. But now let's go to the last level, and that is the unity that happens with Torah, which is even greater than the unity of the chariot, of course, and even greater than the unity of the body and the soul. You might say, Rabbi, how can there be anything greater than the unity of body and soul? So let's continue. In chapter 5, and this is, by the way, going to distinguish between Torah and mitzvos. If there's actually debate in the Talmud, what is greater, Torah study or doing mitzvos? And it goes back and forth and back and forth. And the ultimate answer is, oh, Torah is greater because it brings you to do mitzvos. But the more you study Hasidic philosophy, you'll see that Torah study and mitzvos, and I should probably stop sharing for a moment. You will see that Torah study and mitzvos is kind of this dynamic. Which one is better? A lot of times people look at yeshiva students who study all day, or people who study all the time, and you might wonder, look at them, why are you studying Torah so much? Like, isn't the main point to do a mitzvah? And there's this dynamic, and especially the Rebbe was a big pusher of get out there, just do the mitzvah. But the Rebbe also pushed, study Torah, learn a lot, and they almost seem to come to a head. And the more you study the dynamic of the spiritual underpinnings of Torah mitzvahs, you'll understand why there is this dynamic. The Tanya, in the beginning of the Tanya, in the first, I think, 40 chapters, I forget exactly where it goes, first always props up Torah as the number one, as the top, as the Tanya is about to do right now. It's gonna, even though we've described mitzvahs as great, it's gonna prop up Torah as even better to an extent. But then towards the end of the Tanya will go back to where no, mitzvahs are better than Torah. This dynamic exists because there are some things that Torah has that mitzvahs don't, and there are some things that mitzvahs have that Torah doesn't. You might say, what? But Torah is one of the mitzvahs. Studying of Torah is one of the mitzvahs. So what differentiates it between other mitzvahs? And the answer is, well, no, there is something special about it. That's why we always say to study lots of Torah and do lots of mitzvahs. It's the study of Torah itself is important. Just to give you an example, there are some commandments in the Torah that our sages say possibly never happened. For example, the story of the rebellious child we read in this past week's Torah portion. So the commentary says, if it never happened, why does the Torah give a commandment about it? And the answer is so that we can study about it and learn about it. And when we study and we learn, as we'll see, there's a unity that we get with God that we would not get from mitzvos alone. Mitzvos have a certain level of unity with God, and Torah has a different level of unity with God. And they're both important, but they're different. So let us read about the unity that happens with the Torah. And here I'm at the wrong place. Okay. In the wrong tab. Okay, let's go here. And we only have a couple minutes left, so we'll start this and then we'll continue next week. So it says like this. I'm going to skip to 2 lines down in this section to the bottom. The Tanya now picks up once again on this theme and will explain why the Torah experience is something even greater than a chariot to God. And actually, it's even greater than a body and a soul. It says like this. But thinking and contemplating the Torah in your brain, or using your power of speech for words of Torah in your mouth, falls in a different, higher category than the mitzvahs performed with the rest of the body. Torah study engages deeper parts of you, including thought and speech, which are the inner garments of your divine soul, and certainly your divine soul itself, which is dressed in these garments. So listen to what he said. He says, number one, Torah engages deeper parts of you than a general mitzvah. Most mitzvahs are done with the physical body, right? So number one, a mitzvah gets to a deeper element of you because it goes to your thought and speech. And he says, not only that, but it goes deeper in your soul itself. And then he continues, these inner garments and the soul itself all merge literally in complete union with the divine will and they are not merely a chariot. Through Torah study, your soul and its garments actually merge with the divine will, in contrast to mitzvos, through which you ultimately remain distinct from the divine will, just as a chariot remains separate from a rider. He's going to continue. Why? Because the point of the law which you think or talk about is the divine will itself. Let's read this explanation. Again, what makes Torah study so fascinating? He says like this. The key difference between mitzvah acts and Torah is that a mitzvah act expresses the divine will, whereas Torah is the divine will itself. For example, he's going to give an example. Let me give you an example with a physical body. I want to pick up this toy. My hand fulfilled that will to pick up the toy. But it wasn't my will itself. Sounds weird. I'll give you another example. I have a desire to build a house, and I have all my thoughts in my architecture and my ideas. That's my will. The home is an expression of my will, but it's not actually my will. It accomplishes my will. It does my will, but it is not my will itself. So again, God wants. Let's read his example here. For example, consider the commandment to take an etrog on the festival of Sukkot along with the 3 other species of plants. When you do that, the divine will expresses itself through the citron. But if there were no such mitzvah, there would still be citrons in the world. And if the citron is taken on Passover, it does not express divine will. Clearly, the citron exists as an autonomous entity which under certain conditions express the divine will. Now compare that with the divine will itself, as expressed in the Torah. You shall take an esrog on Sukkot. If God had never willed this, the idea itself would not exist. The Torah's instructions is not merely a vehicle which expresses the divine will, it is the divine will itself. I'll give you an example before we continue. My example of the case of the rebellious son in the Torah. Even though the case of the rebellious son never happened, that is still a divine will. The mitzvah that God gives there is still God's will, even though the case will never happen. That's why when you study it, you're becoming one with God, because it's 2 separate things. There's what you want, and there's an expression of your will. That's why the Talmud, if you study the Talmud, it goes through all different crazy scenarios. What would be the law here? What would be the law there? What would be the law here? Number one, we're saying these because we want to know what happens if those scenarios happen. But even if those scenarios don't happen, we are trying to figure out what is the divine will, because the unity that you can have with the divine will is in a sense greater than unifying with the divine will's expression. There's actually there's this case in the Talmud about it went through this whole scenario of how someone could be related in 8 different ways, and how many prohibitions you can have in one sexual relationship. And when you study it, like, why drive my mind in a present? Nobody is ever going to do this, because we want to get down to what is God's will, even if there's no practical takeaway in a scenario that will actually happen. There may be a takeaway in a spiritual life, how I live, but even if there's no practical takeaway, because getting down to what the divine will is itself is a greater unity. And so when you're studying the Torah, you are not only doing God's will, you are at that moment one with God's will. God was nice enough to give you his will and allow you to think like he thinks when you study the Torah. And that's a beautiful unity that doesn't happen anywhere else. That happens only in the Torah, where you're not only becoming a vehicle for an expression of God's will, but you are God's will itself. The hand is an expression of your mind's thoughts, of your will, but it is not the will itself. It becomes unified with what you want, but it is not the desire itself. That's the downside of the body and the soul analogy. The body and the soul, as I kept saying, are at the end of the day 2 separate entities. They create the greatest oneness that we can see in this world, but they are still not one. The ultimate oneness is when you not only become an expression for God's will, but you become, so to speak, God's will itself. And only the mind, through studying Torah, can do that. Let's continue reading here. So when you study, that will, let's go to the next page, allow you to achieve a deeper union with God than you do by observing a mitzvah, which is merely an expression of God's will. For all the laws of the Torah are channels through which the inner divine will flows. When you study Torah, your mind absorbs the idea that arose in his will, when a certain entity is permissible, kosher to eat, exempt patur, innocent in judgment, or the reverse, forbidden, non-kosher, obligated, or guilty. The Kabbalists perceive no detail of Jewish law as arbitrary. Even minutiae of law convey the divine will. And then he continues, and so to the entire combination of letters that constitute the Torah, the prophets, and the writings are channels of flow for God's will and wisdom. I just want to say the commentaries of the Tanya point out, why did he specify the scriptures? Because scripture is unique. All Torah, you're not considered studying Torah unless you understand what you're reading. Scripture, even if you don't understand what you're reading, you are considered studying Torah. So that's just an important thing to know. If you don't have the brain space for study, just reading scripture alone is considered becoming one with God's will. As he says, and the text is merged in total union with the Blessed One. God is boundless, defying any concept that might contain or grasp him. It seems counterintuitive then the Torah. Okay. It might seem counterintuitive then that the Torah text, which convey precise ideas through the use of specific letter shapes, could be an authentic expression as formless source. But that the Kabbalah teaches is the miracle of the Torah. It's every letter is a container for infinite, a vessel in the world form of formlessness of God. Okay. I'm sorry I had to go quick because I want to stop here. As Maimonides writes, he is the knower, the power to know, and the know. Okay, I can't read it, but the point is, can't read this state. The point is that when you study Torah, the study of Torah is not only like the limbs of God. Mitzvos actually allow you to have a complete merging at that moment with the oneness of God. And since it's already 1 o'clock, we're going to have to stop here. But the takeaway from today is, of course, number one, the beauty and the oneness that we can attain when we do a mitzvah. And number two, even more than that, the beauty and the oneness that we can attain when we study Torah is, to a sense, even greater. And so therefore the minutiae of the Torah should not disturb you. Recognize, why am I studying the minutiae? The minutiae is there to allow me to get to the bottom of God's will. And when I'm studying God's will, I'm not only becoming one with an expression of God's will, I'm able to become one with God himself. And with that, I will stop the recording unless, yeah.